we're going to be talking about the beginning of the activist phase of the civil rights movement from roughly the early 1960s through the decade of the 1960s. Before 1960, as we noted last time, the civil rights movement was primarily focused on court cases and boycotts, like the Montgomery bus boycott, and like the court cases dealing with the desegregation of public school systems, mainly in the southern part of the United States. However, beginning in 1960, the civil rights movement took a more activist turn. And one of the reasons why the civil rights movement took an activist turn in 1960 was the entrance into the demonstrations of college and high school students, mostly Black, but a good number of white students as well. And this particular phase of the civil rights movement resulted in the two major pieces of landmark legislation of the movement, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended segregation in public facilities, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the rights of Black citizens, of eligible Black citizens, to vote. So let us begin. As we noted last time, the activist phase of the civil rights movement actually began on February 1st, 1960, when four young Black men from a Black university in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a lunch counter and were not served. They were not served because the lunch counter was for whites only. And of course, as you can see in this photograph, they are Black. It was all orchestrated that way. They knew that they were not going to be served, and they wanted to use this demonstration as an example that racial segregation was not only segregating white and Black, but racial segregation also meant exclusion. That is, they couldn't eat at a downtown lunch counter. They could not go to the school near their home. They could not sit anywhere they wanted to in a movie theater. So segregation really was a means of exclusion. In other words, Black Americans were not part of American society in reality. The following day, February 2nd, 1960, they were joined by other Black students from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro, and they were also joined by students from the North Carolina Women's University, also in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this was significant because these young women were all white. And if you know anything about the racial composition and racial interaction, particularly in the American South during the 20th century, you know the mixture of Black men and white women really would generate not only publicity, but perhaps violence. And sure enough, when these young women from the Women's College at Greensboro sat down at the lunch counter with young black men, a mob came into the store and started to attack the young black men. Uh, they threw food at them, they beat them, and this really marked the beginning of the confrontational stage of the civil rights movement. It was a landmark event because not only were these people not professional agitators, but they were students, young men and young women who were white, who wanted racial equality in the South because that was what supposedly our Constitution guaranteed. Now, in back in 1947, this sit-in occurred in 1960, but back in 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court had delivered an opinion which stated that when you travel interstate, in other words, when you go from my state of North Carolina to Georgia or Alabama, that is obviously interstate travel. And therefore, it is covered by an agency called the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the Interstate Commerce Commission had a policy of that there would be no segregation. Well, here you see a bus terminal and you see colored waiting room. Well, of course, that was illegal, but black people were afraid to challenge it because they would be met with violence. And sure enough, when they did challenge it, they were met with violence. So beginning in 1960 and continuing into 1961, we had a movement called the Freedom Rides, where people would board buses in Washington, D.C., and travel south through Virginia, through my state of North Carolina, and into South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Once they reached Alabama, however, which is in the deep South, violence erupted. And as you can see here, what happened was that a mob set the bus on fire. Fortunately, nobody was injured or killed. The passengers, you can see here on the lawn, the passengers exited the bus without harm. But it reflected the type of resistance that demonstrators would meet, that they would meet violence and injury and ultimately even death. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that riding buses or sitting at lunch counters was a very long process. Okay, you sit in at a lunch counter. Well, what happened when that occurred is that the management just shut the lunch counter. So there's no more lunch counter. So something needed to happen that would affect the entire South, number one. And number two, that would raise the consciousness of the American public. Because let's face it, people living in Chicago or Minneapolis or San Francisco, when they heard that black people couldn't eat at a certain lunch counter, Well, that's too bad, but it's their problem. So Martin Luther King Jr. got together with his colleagues in their organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and said, we've got to do something dramatic. We've got to capture the attention of the American people. And we've got to use that new medium called television to broadcast what was happening to Black Americans, particularly in the South. So King had this idea, let's go to the most segregated, the roughest city in America, Birmingham, Alabama. I used to live in Birmingham, so I know that certainly was the case. And let us launch a children's crusade because the police would dare not attack them, would dare not violence on these school children. And so the school children marched. And the police really didn't know what to do about it because they knew that if they started beating the children, that would generate tremendously bad publicity. So what they did, they just marched the children, and you can see here in Birmingham in April of 1963, they marched the children of Birmingham into police vans, and they arrested them and put them in prison. They didn't hurt them or beat them. They just took them off the street. Well, once the children were arrested, some older Black people in Birmingham took over the demonstration. And this is what happened. The police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, who was also the fire chief, decided to have the fire department spray the demonstrators with high pressure hoses. Now, again, it's uncomfortable, obviously, to be sprayed with a fire hose, but the violence was relatively minimal. But when the demonstrations in Birmingham persisted, the police began to use attack dogs, German shepherds. And here you see two police officers attacking with German shepherd dogs attacking a demonstrator, a peaceful demonstrator in Birmingham. And the thing of it was that all of this, particularly this scene, all of this was shown on national television because the news broadcasts said, hey, this is action. This is news. It's not so much action to see children marching into buses and therefore, as a result, being put away somewhere beyond in prison. So this was action. And of course, the television networks and the viewing public like action. And it was action that was particularly terrible to see. Dogs attacking peaceful demonstrators. And it became so violent that President John F. Kennedy, who really did not want to address civil rights issues because he was going to run for a second term as president, and he did not want to upset Democrats in the South because he really needed their votes. So Kennedy went on national television to condemn the attacks in Birmingham. All the demonstrators wanted was to have equal access to restaurants, hotels, housing, and schools in the city of Birmingham. They didn't want something special. They didn't want something that nobody else had. They just wanted to be part of Birmingham society. And President Kennedy went on national television, and what he said was absolutely true. This is not really a political issue. This is not like taxes. This is not like trade. This is a moral issue. And if we don't do something about it, we are immoral. We are not addressing this issue. And then what happened? Nothing. Nothing. Because again, he was planning to run for a second term as president, and he really needed the South. And as we've seen, the South tended to be solidly Democratic because, of course, the Republicans made war on the South during the American Civil War. And he needed those electoral votes. So nothing was done. And that really upset Martin Luther King Jr. And Black leadership generally. Yet it was also true that a national public address calling Southern whites immoral was not likely to be taken lightly in the Deep South, particularly in the city of Birmingham, which reaped lots of bad publicity. So in September of 1963, the Ku Klux Klan, which was a white supremacist, which is a white supremacist organization, planted a bomb in a prominent black church in Birmingham. Blew up, well, as you can see here, blew up the church and killed 4 young black girls. And here they are. This past year was the 60th anniversary. And you can see the church here. And these are the 4 black children who were killed by that bomb. And they ranged in age from 11 to 14. And that really shocked a nation. But it did not move the Kennedy administration to do anything about it. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. had just come back from Washington, D.C., where he had led a march of hundreds of thousands of people. And you can see them here. Here's the Washington Monument. And he's standing by the Lincoln Memorial, very symbolic. And I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but yeah, there were lots of black people there, but there were also white people who were just fed up, not only with the violence, but fed up with the separation of the races for no good reason and in contradiction to our Constitution. So Martin Luther King Jr. gave an address in Washington, D.C., at the March on Washington. And he talked about a dream that he had. And that dream was that white and Black Americans would come together, would come together in schools, would come together in churches, would come together in neighborhoods, and would be equal in all of the things of American equality. That was his dream. Now, of course, we know shortly after the March on Washington, shortly after the church bombing in September of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. There was no civil rights bill introduced to Congress. There was no advance of any policies that would address racial segregation. And history has a way of making heroes out of very unlikely people. And here we see one such hero, Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson came from a poor family, unlike John Kennedy, who came from a very wealthy family. Lyndon B. Johnson came from an area of Texas that was not particularly prosperous. But he decided when he was in high school that he was going to go to college, be the first member of his family to attend a university. So he enrolled in Sam Houston State College. But after 1 year, he had to quit. He had to quit because he could not afford to go to college anymore. It wasn't that the tuition was so high, is that he could not afford to eat, to stay. So he took a job as a teacher in southern Texas at a school with mostly Hispanic kids, with kids from Mexico. And you can see the school here, students here. And he was a baseball coach. And he also taught American history. But what impressed Lyndon Johnson, as you can see him back here, what impressed Lyndon Johnson about these Mexican American kids is that they all had dreams. They all had dreams that they would, despite the prejudice against them, they would make their way in the world. And by golly, he was going to see to it that they had that opportunity. Now, in the following year, as you all know, Lyndon Johnson became president when John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And 1964 was an election year. And of course, Lyndon Johnson said that he would run again. And his opponent, Republican Party, a very conservative senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater had his own story of being the son and grandson of Jewish immigrants from Europe. And he went to Arizona, which is in the Southwest, uh, and became a successful businessman. And this was his platform. And he was for civil rights. But what he says here, the key to racial and religious tolerance lies not in laws alone, but in the hearts of men. And that was his idea, that you don't need laws. What we need is to change the hearts of men. Well, that may take a long time. Uh, and also, he was for low taxes and a vigorous military budget. Uh, and one of the things he liked to do was to quote Lyndon Johnson's comments on civil rights. Now, Lyndon Johnson came from Texas, a southern state, a state that practiced rigorous racial segregation. And when he was majority leader in the United States Senate, he said a few things that would certainly get him reelected in Texas, but not make him very popular among Black citizens. For example, I am not now and never have been an advocate of civil rights. You can't force these things on the South overnight. And then he said, we are going to pass a civil rights bill if it takes all summer. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, of course, Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president, became president. One of the first things he said was, I'm liberated. I'm liberated from having to run again in a southern state. I'm liberated so I can support and lead policies, particularly in the area of civil rights. And that is what I'm going to dedicate my presidency to. And sure enough, one of the first things he did as president in January of 1964 was to submit a Civil Rights Act to Congress. Now, as you know, Harry Truman did the same thing in 1948, and it got nowhere. But 1964 was a little different because of the demonstrations. And the Civil Rights Bill that Lyndon Johnson submitted to Congress became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And people told Lyndon Johnson, oh, you're just going to throw away your political future. I mean, nobody's interested in civil rights. I don't know if you remember what I said a couple of weeks ago, but I mentioned that in Harry Truman's administration, 6% of Americans, 6% of white Americans thought civil rights was an important issue. Certainly that percentage increased by the 1960s, but still it was a minority position. And yet Lyndon B. Johnson felt that this was important. It's not only important for America at home, but also important for America abroad, because we were fighting the Soviet Union. Not literally, but we were engaged in a Cold War. And the Soviets would say to their allies in Africa and Asia, well, you see what they do to people who are not white. This is their system. It's a system only for whites. And Lyndon Johnson now was free to pursue a policy that would change that. And you can see here that there was no political retribution to Lyndon Johnson because he easily defeated Barry Goldwater in one of the most lopsided presidential contests in American history. Goldwater, again, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. Goldwater won his home state of Arizona, and of course, the 5 Deep South states where blacks couldn't vote. So that was not really surprising. But the key, I think, was when Lyndon Johnson submitted the Civil Rights Bill into Congress, and it became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Barry Goldwater voted against that. He voted against it because he said you shouldn't force people to accept somebody in a restaurant of a different color. You shouldn't force people to accept somebody of a different color in a hotel or in a school or in a theater. And the Deep South really liked that. And they voted for Barry Goldwater. But Lyndon Johnson prevailed. But there was one major racial problem remaining in civil rights, and that was the right to vote. I mentioned those Deep South states that all supported Barry Goldwater. Well, as I said, black people couldn't vote in those states, so that's naturally the case. So in January of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and his black organization decided that they would launch a campaign to get blacks the right to vote. And again, he didn't choose an easy state. He chose the worst state, Alabama. And his plan was to march from Selma, Alabama, an area that had a large black population who could not vote, to the state capital in Montgomery. It's about a 60-mile, about 90 kilometers walk. And they were going to march. On March the 7th, a group of black and white marchers left church in Selma, walked through downtown, and then had to cross the Alabama River, which was bridged by the Edmund Pettus Bridge, onto the state highway that would take them to the state capitol in Montgomery. And as they marched onto the bridge, On the other side, on the state highway, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, had stationed highway patrolmen to block them, to block the marchers from marching on that road to the state capitol at Montgomery. And when the marchers reached the middle of the bridge, at the highest point, they knelt down to pray as they saw the police on the other side. And Major John Cloud of the Alabama Highway Patrol stepped forward, had a bullhorn, and he said, "This is an illegal march. You must disperse now." And the demonstrators continued to pray. And at that point, the highway patrol, some on horseback, advanced, and you could see what they did to the marchers. This man is John Lewis, and they fractured his skull. Well, you can see what was going to happen here. I point this out because John Lewis eventually became a congressman from Georgia, a state where he, at this time, could not even vote, let alone think of becoming a congressman. And he became a great civil rights leader, but he paid a price for that leadership. And I remember that day well. I was not there. I was safe at home and getting ready to watch Sunday Night at the Movies. The ABC television network had started this movie show where they would show movies that had recently been released from Hollywood. You could see movies on TV at the time, but many of these movies were from the 1940s, from the 1950s, not from the 1960s. And as it happened, that night, March 7th, 1965, the ABC television network was showing Judgment at Nuremberg. It was about the Nuremberg trials after World War II that showcased the atrocities that the Nazi government had perpetrated during World War II. And I remember sitting and watching my television, and all of a sudden the screen went blank. And a scene like this suddenly appeared. And I thought, oh, this has to be from World War II, a scene from World War II. And then you look closely and you see, no, it's not a scene. Then what is it? And of course, the announcer came on and said that there had been a police riot in Selma, Alabama that day. And it was at first hard to distinguish Nuremberg from Alabama. And it shocked the nation because, as I said earlier, the medium of television, many people by that time, most Americans, had television. And most Americans were watching that Sunday night movie, and suddenly you see something that seems like, oh, it's from World War II. No, it's from Alabama, March 1965. And Lyndon B. Johnson, president at the time, went on national television. And you can see him here speaking before the Congress. And it was a brilliant speech. It was a brilliant speech because He didn't say, well, we need to give blacks the right to vote. We need to give them full equality. No, he didn't say that. That would have been the obvious thing to say. What he said was that for the sake of all Americans, black and white, we need to provide voting rights for all Americans. We need to provide equal education for all Americans. We need to provide equal access to housing for all Americans. In other words, what he did is made these rights universal. Oh, these are rights not just for black people. These are rights for all of us, because a part of us doesn't, if we don't have those rights for part of our citizens, then it will negatively affect our country and all of our people, regardless of race. So it was a beautiful, one of the great speeches ever of a president to Congress and to the American people. So that very day, March 15th, 1965, President Johnson introduced voting rights legislation into the Congress. And that became, on August 5th, 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the right of all eligible Americans, regardless of color, to vote in our elections. And to emphasize that point, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and here you see an interracial group of whites and blacks, took up again on March 21st, 1965, took up again the march from Selma to Montgomery. And this time it occurred without violence. And instead of violence, you had music.
Could you sing We Shall Overcome with me, please? We shall overcome. We shall overcome. I do believe we shall overcome someday.
That was Joan Baez singing the civil rights anthem, We Shall Overcome. And it really was the anthem of the civil rights movement, because there were so many things to overcome. There were so many obstacles. There were the laws in the South and in other parts of the country. There was the Congress. There was a reluctant president, John Kennedy. And finally, it came to pass. Six days later, it changed. The city of Los Angeles, which had, although people did not know it at the time, or know it very much, which had a difficult race relations problem, erupted into violence when a police officer stopped a black driver and the black neighborhood called Watts in Los Angeles had had enough of police intervention and particularly police brutality. And so they started to attack the police. And of course, here you see a casualty, one casualty from that. And the demonstrator, what the police notice, of course, all the police are white, and you have one black man there. But this was the result of the Watts neighborhood in August of 1965, less than a week after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I know many white Americans were saying at the time, hey, what's going on? We've just had two great laws last year, 1964, making public accommodations open to all, and now the Voting Rights Act. Why are they rioting? The fact was that these were great laws, 1964 and 1965, but they did not change everything in terms of race. And what you see here is the destruction of a neighborhood. Eventually, the president had to send out the National Guard. You can see this is a National Guard vehicle here. And there was a backlash, a political backlash. Well, we can't have black people destroying property, demonstrating like that. That's not going to work. So the governor of Alabama, we've talked about Alabama, right here, George Wallace, decided to run for president. And people didn't really give him much chance, especially when he had to go up north to compete in the primaries. And guess what? When he went to Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Maryland, he got lots of votes from white people there, places where there were very few blacks, and places you would think that would not be susceptible to segregationist views. And that opened up the eyes of many people in the country that this racial problem was not just in the South, here in North Carolina or in the deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, but race was a problem nationally. It was a problem nationally. And George Wallace's candidacy went into a third party. And of course, that's very difficult under our political system. And Richard Nixon became president in 1968. But Wallace's candidacy highlighted the fact that racial issues were dividing not only the South, but were dividing the country. And when you talk about toxic politics these days in 2024, it was pretty toxic in 1968, I can tell you. And it became even more toxic in April of 1968, when you can see here, barely see, Martin Luther King was murdered, was shot by a gunman in this building, shooting into this motel and killing Dr. King in my hometown of Memphis, Tennessee. And so the civil rights movement, many believed, had ended, and it had ended tragically. But more than that, it also exposed the deep divisions in the country. This has nothing to do with race. This was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. And you can see the police here beating the demonstrators, who are all white. So it was a mark that our country, people believed, was falling apart. You hear those comments today. Well, we've been there before. We've been there before. So the 1968 election results are not surprising. Many Americans were fed up with the violence. And of course, in the South, again in the South, George Wallace was prominent and won the southern states. As far as the blue states were concerned, Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic Party candidate, and the Democratic Party was in disarray. Lyndon Johnson decided not to run again. And then Robert F. Kennedy decided he was going to run for president, but then he was assassinated. And so Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, nice fellow, good ideas, but it was not a good time to be a Democrat. And Richard Nixon won fairly easily, as you can see here, red, Republican, blue, Democrat. But that presidential election, the 1968 presidential election, was the first opportunity for millions of Black citizens in the South to cast their ballots. And here you see a long line of Black people in Alabama waiting to vote. And you can see the difference between 1960, when, of course, most Black people could not register to vote, and 1971, when most Black people could. So in Mississippi, for example, 5% of Black people could vote in 1960, but 59% by 1971. It did not necessarily change the dynamics of these Deep South states in terms of their hostility to civil rights, but it did start to change the political complexion as the Republicans like Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon began to draw white Southerners away from the Democratic Party, away from the memory of the American Civil War, toward the Republicans. But at the same time, there continued to be issues that reflected the hostility or the inability of white people, particularly in government, to address the needs of Black Americans. Here we have in Atlanta at the time, the brand new Hyatt Regency Hotel in the late 1960s. And you can see other hotels in the background. What happened was something called urban renewal. And what urban renewal did was to flatten, destroy Black neighborhoods, poor Black neighborhoods, and instead build luxury apartment buildings, shopping centers, and luxury hotels to draw conventions, to draw people into the city center. And this was not only in Atlanta, Georgia. This is New York City, which, as you all know, is in the north. In New York City, what happened was that this entire black neighborhood in Midtown Manhattan flattened. And they were building Lincoln Center for the performing arts. And in St. Louis, the city fathers of St. Louis decided, well, we need to build housing for black people. We're tearing down a lot of stuff, and where are they going to go? So they built the Pruitt-Igoe public housing in St. Louis. Good intentions, but concrete, nothing around it. And what happened? Blew up. Blew up. A multi-billion-dollar development. They just blew it up because it was vandalized, it was not taken care of, and it was difficult for the people who lived there to get to work, if they could find work. And this was a symptom of what was happening in other cities in America. What was happening in the 1970s was that white people were leaving and black people couldn't find housing in the city center. This is a picture of Baltimore, downtown Baltimore, on a Friday night in 1970. Now, as all of you know, if you go to any city center on a Friday night, you're going to find lots of things going on. There are restaurants, movies, theaters, shows, shopping. But look at Baltimore on a Friday night in 1970. And why? Because all you see are hotels, parking garages. People don't live there anymore. And when people don't live there anymore, the area becomes unsafe. So the civil rights movement, which reached its pinnacle with the march from Selma to Montgomery and the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, had devolved into an America at odds with itself and with its cities. How we would address these disparities will form the basis for our next program. Thank you.